Hello and welcome to another episode of the Scripting Them podcast. I'm Fernando as usual, and in today's episode we're going to cover the art of code review, or if you will, the necessity of code review. And what not to do, and maybe some suggestions of what to do during a code review session. So let's get started. So the first thing to understand is that code review should be a fundamental part of a development process. If you're working with someone, at least with one other person, if you're not the sole developer of the application you're working on, there should always be a code review process for the simple reason of, we're humans. And as humans, we tend to have a bias as to a way to solve a problem. And we're also very prone to errors. So we might, without even noticing, introduce errors in our logic, or misunderstand a requirement, or simply code in a way that is not ideal for whatever you're trying to do or for whatever's coming next. There are, essentially, what I'm trying to say is there are a ton of things that we as human developers can do wrong during a coding session. So having a peer reviewing our work from outside without that connection that we create with the code that we write, it's going to give us a perspective that we can't really get on our own. Through that process, through that code reviewing, from others, we're not only catching bugs, we're not only improving the quality of the code that we produce, we're also learning. We're both sides of the review process are learning through a code review session, and that's also something that we need to remember. It's not just about finding problems, it's not just about pointing fingers. This is a learning experience if done right, and that is what I'm trying to say here. So something that has to happen during a code review is it needs to, the team, or at least the people involved in that code review, they need to establish a secure, positive, and respectful space where things can be said without them being personal. Again, a code review session is not about pointing fingers, and it's not about highlighting what the developer who wrote the code doesn't know. It's just about trying to be objective at the fact that whatever you create doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect, actually, and that there are always ways in which it can be improved. You might agree with those ways or not, and that is also something that should be part of the code review. But at least you need to be able to have that conversation. Someone reviewing your code should be able to openly say, this bit of logic is wrong, or, this code here or this line here is not clear enough. Maybe you can improve it this way, or maybe you can just add a comment here because it's not obvious of what this thing is doing, even if you don't agree with it. Even if for you that line was obvious, the fact that someone else is highlighting that means that it's not always for everyone, right? So through an open conversation, always remembering to respect each other and to support each other, you should be able to openly talk about the code, to discuss what's right and what's wrong about the code, and potential strategies to solve that code, to solve those problems. Now, some things that are not great during code review are, for example, coming into a code review expecting problems, expecting your code to be wrong. You don't, that essentially generates stress. I've been through those processes before when I was getting started, and getting my code review by other developers was actually a quite stressful moment for me, because I would feel like inadequate. I would feel like I wasn't doing the right thing in my job, then eventually I realized that I do have my expertise, I do have my own experiences to back up why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I can explain and I can talk through my thinking process that got me to write a specific piece of code that we're reviewing. It might be wrong, it might be right for the occasion, but at least I can have that conversation, and that's what I'm trying to say here. As the developer who wrote the code being reviewed, you are definitely entitled, or you should be given the opportunity to explain yourself as to why a piece of code was written that way. Mind you, it's not about justifying your work, but rather it's about explaining the concepts so that or explaining the logic behind it so that the person reviewing it can fully understand what you were trying to do. This is especially useful if the other developer looking at the code doesn't have the full context of your task. For example, maybe they're not even part of the same project or working on the same feature as you. They just know the technology enough to review your code, which is completely valid. But in that situation, they might think something's wrong or not ideal. And that's where you can say, well, actually, I coded it this way because I have these other constraints, or I have these other things in mind coming in the future. Again, it's not about justifying yourself and taking it personal. A code review session should never be personal, either sides of the coin. You just have to be able to explain why you did things the way you did them, and the other person will take that information and decide whether that is still valid or not. And again, in the end, the code review session will yield suggestions to improve the code and the logic. Ideally, those suggestions should not be mandatory. In the end, you're the owner of your own code, and you should be held responsible for whether you improve the code or not, and how you improve it. The session, this code review session, is here to give you ideas, clearly to highlight problems, definitely. But on an ideal scenario, through the conversations, if those problems are valid, you will accept those problems and eventually fix them, because we don't want to ship buggy code. That's definitely something that we don't want to do. It's just sometimes there are certain aspects of the logic of the code that some developers might see right when other developers might not agree with them. And it's not about a bug, it's not about performance or anything, it's just about like coding styles. That should never be, unless you're breaking the team's coding standards, in which case definitely that is a problem. But if it's just something subjective, that this other person is considers a better practice than what you're doing, then I would say that you're definitely should not be forced to change it the way they see it. Now, something that to consider if you're not the one being reviewed, but rather the one reviewing code, is that the person being reviewed might be under stress, might feel a little bit defensive, right? So it's important to, at the beginning of the coding session, establish that this is not a personal evaluation of the developer as an employee. This is just a review of a piece of code that needs to be objective and should never be taken or done personally. You're not attacking, if you're finding problems with the code or with the logic, you're never attacking the person. You're just highlighting something that can be fixed. This is a very important piece to explain. And if you've been doing this for a while, it might seem obvious to you, but if you're reviewing the code of someone who's new, either to the team or to the profession itself, it might not be obvious to them. So it's important always to create a safe environment where this conversation can happen. Now, it's also important to understand that you as a reviewer are not intrinsically right of everything that you say. Just because you have a view of how a piece of code should be written doesn't mean that the version written by someone else is wrong, simply because it's just not the same as you were expecting. So you have to objectively, you essentially have to remove that internal bias that you have as to, regarding the problem to be solved or regarding the technology being used, and focused on what is defined as a standard for your company or for your team. If you have coding standards, which you should, as all teams should, if you have best practices to think about, then those considerations that are known and the same for everyone should be tackled during the code review. Obviously, things like bugs, things like missing logic path, things like that should also be taken into account. But when you get into the more subjective aspects of a code review, you start mixing up your own preferences into the code review. You'll end up trying to get them to be you, and that is not, what you want to get out of the code review. So as a code reviewer, you have to remember to keep that internal bias out of your way. In the end, a code review session should yield comments and suggestions to improve code. This is clearly, code review is not the place where you find big bugs. There's usually unit tests that happen first. There is usually probably there could be a QA process from a functional point of view that happens first. And then when you're ready to close a feature and push it into the main branch, then this is where the code review session happens, to make sure that coding standards are being applied, to make sure that there are no extra bits of logic or missing bits of logic that are just not meant to be there or should be there, but were not caught by any of the other processes. This is not the place where you find huge bugs. If that is the case, then you're probably missing some other steps prior to the code review. And if that's also the case, that it means that the code review is being done too early in the process, and you're wasting time. Let's put it that way. You're wasting the reviewer's time and the developer's time, because you should be doing, again, all the things in that time to solve these problems, to find them on a more automatic way, and to fix them, and then review the code once it's stable enough. In the end, the code review session should be an experience, a learning experience for both sides, especially for the one being reviewed, because they should go into this session with an open mind, expecting to learn something from that process. But the reviewer should also come into it expecting to be corrected if they make an incorrect assumption, and also expecting to learn something about the technology through reviewing something they've never seen before. There is no, the reviewer is not always right, and the reviewee is not always wrong. Let's remember that as well. And essentially, to close the episode, all I want to say is that code reviews should not happen once every blue moon. They should actually be part of the development process of any new feature. This helps the team to grow in expertise, to level the skills of the entire team, mixing who review who, and at the same time, it ensures that the quality of the code in the main repository stays constant, or as constant as possible, avoiding things like technical debt that is created unwillingly by developers trying to do their job without their code being reviewed by third parties. Essentially, remember, the main thing that you want to get to achieve through a code review is to remove that internal bias that you have as the developer who wrote the code, thinking that whatever you're doing is the right thing to do, simply because you wrote it. Someone else looking at it from the outside will give you a different perspective that you didn't have before. So that's it. I hope that this little insight into what a code review is and should be gives you the tools to not fear them anymore if you did in the past, and also give you a different perspective if you're usually the reviewer in these sessions, to remember to create that safe space and to think about how the other person is feeling when their work is being reviewed. And that's it for today. So thank you and happy coding. And that was it for this episode of the Scripting Them podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you can find me online on Twitter at TheDeepMan123. And you can also find the podcast YouTube channel just searching for the Scripting Them on YouTube. Thank you again, and I'll catch you on the next one.